Stanford University.
This program is brought to you by the Stanford Humanities Center. For more information, please visit us at shc.stanford.edu.
Good evening. My name is Grant Parker. On behalf of Stanford's Department of Classics, I'd like to welcome you to the 12th Lawrence Eitner Lecture, Antiquity to a Wider Public. It's wonderful to see such a good turnout this evening. The series has been endowed by Peter and Lindsay Joost, friends and benefactors of Stanford Classics, in honor of Lawrence Eitner, who died in 2009. Born 80 years previously in what was then Czechoslovakia, Lawrence Eitner studied in Germany and, fleeing Nazi atrocities, came to the United States, studying at Duke and Princeton universities. At Stanford from 1963 to 1989, Professor Eitner served as director of Stanford's Art Museum, now known as the Cantor Art Center, for a long time. He also chaired what was then the Department of Art and Architecture and was himself a distinguished expert on French Romantic painting, especially Géricault, with a dozen books to his name. In naming these annual lectures after him, we honor the memory of a renowned scholar, teacher, and writer who oversaw the process that raised our university's art museum from the 33,000 square feet. Today, I'm thrilled to be welcoming Ace in London. Surely the first Eitner lecturer to have all his degrees in mathematics from Cambridge and Bristol universities, Dr. Freeth spent 23 very successful years in film and television as an award-winning director for Thames Television, the BBC, and Channel 4 on scientific, cultural, and social issues, as well as medical science. Television cameras have turned instead on Tony himself for his work on the Antikythera mechanism, the extraordinary device dubbed by several writers as the world's first computer. I think we'll get to decide for ourselves. Tony is the expert, the one whose research finally led to that aha moment in understanding this intriguing object more than a century after its discovery in 1900. His interpretations, published in Nature and other top journals, are the radical new advances and the definitive interpretations that would have been unthinkable without his mathematician's background, to say nothing about his director's pragmatism in getting complicated projects together. Tony, your appearance today as the Eitner lecturer is a timely demonstration of what stunning results come from collaborative, brilliant, whatever it has to say. We've been looking forward tremendously to your lecture, The Antikythera Mechanism, a Shocking Discovery from Greece.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Professor Parker. What you're seeing here is X-ray slices through the main surviving fragment of the Antikythera mechanism. You can see all the details of the gears, the pins, the bearings, the arbors, the inscriptions. It's a truly complicated device. It's also probably the most extraordinary artifact ever discovered from the ancient world, and one of the true wonders of the ancient world. It's a work of genius which continues to surprise and shock us as we discover more about it. I have to say I've had a really great time here in California. I love Stanford University. I bought the cap. Yeah? It's got a fantastic. It will challenge all your preconceptions about the classical world. First, I'd like to thank Professor Walter Scheidel for inviting me to give this lecture, and Professor Grant, memorable tours of the campus. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank my good friend and longtime Antikythera collaborator, Tom Maltzbender, who's somewhere here in the audience, and his fiancée, Ali Strand, for their very warm, generous, and thoughtful and considerate hospitality while I've been here. They nearly killed me. They took me to Yosemite Valley, and they took me walking up to the top. I very nearly didn't make it down, I have to say. So I'm very pleased to be here to give this lecture. But it was an absolutely fantastic experience. I'd also like to thank Peter and Lindsay Joost for their very imaginative and generous support of this lecture series, this very challenging and interesting lecture series. I have to say, it's a great privilege to be here at Stanford giving this lecture. And I'm not really sure that I'm quite up to it. But what I do know is that the Antikythera mechanism is up to it. So I hope you're going to forget my inadequacies while you're dazzled by the genius of the ancient Greeks. What I want to tell you is, what I want to talk to you about is why the Antikythera mechanism was such a shocking discovery from ancient Greece. I'm going to its identity. What, where, when, who, and why. The story starts, obviously, with its discovery, and with a man called Fotis Lindiakos, seen here with his family in a small island called Symi in the eastern Mediterranean, which is a sponge fishing island. And Lindiakos ran sponge fishing boats. In 1900, he sent a sponge fishing boat off to travel west across the Mediterranean to their normal sponge fishing grounds. And when they reached a tiny island called Antikythera, they encountered a severe storm. They had to take shelter from the storm. But when the storm subsided, the captain, Demetrios Kondos, decided to send down one of the youngest divers, Elias Stadiatis, to see what he might find in the local waters. And said that he'd seen a heap of dead, naked people underwater. These turned out to be sculptures scattered on the sea floor, along with a lot of other artifacts, amphorae and so on. He'd stumbled on an ancient wreck. So the captain himself went down and found a bronze arm, which he brought to the surface. Now, they had commercial pressures. They had to get on with their sponge fishing tour, so they carried on, taking the bronze arm with them, and eventually went back to Symi. And there, apparently, they debated as to what they might do. Should they perhaps, next season, go back and plunder the wreck, or should they tell the grateful that they did tell the authorities, who organized the first Navy, provided a gunboat, the Mikali, to stand by to deter looters. And the sponge fishermen themselves were commissioned to carry out. In 1900, they didn't have too much luck because of storms. But in 1901, they started to bring up some very serious artifacts. It was a stunning find. It was a true treasure ship. It was full of wonderful bronzes that you can see here, superb jewelry, amphorae, tableware, many, many other objects. But one object that no one noticed or regarded at the time was a corroded lump. It must have come out of the sea in one piece. This is the earliest picture we have of it, taken in artifacts to the National Archaeological Museum, and set aside in a store of stuff to be examined later. And then a visiting former minister, Valerius Stais, came to the museum and he noticed that it had split apart. And in crude mechanical gears that you might find in a windmill or a watermill, these were precision gears with teeth about 1 millimeter long. It was a truly shocking discovery. They simply should not have been there in an ancient Greek artifact. So the key question was, what on earth is this object? And I'm going to some people thought it was a navigation instrument. It had come from a ship, after all. and some thought it might be a geared astrolabe, which is a device for tracking. So many academic disputes, there was very heated and quite controversial dispute, and both sides were wrong. Who did make significant progress, called Albert Rehm. He was a philologist, a German philologist, expert on ancient. Later, in 1930, he would become rector of Munich University, but he was strongly anti-Nazi, and he was forced out of his job and forced into what they called internal exile in Germany, and he was only reinstated into his job at the end of the war. Back in 1905, though, he started to look at the fragments, particularly this fragment C. This is one of the main fragments. The main fragments are lettered A, B, C, etc. And on the face of this fragment, and he read the name of an Egyptian month name written in Greek, and there were a lot of divisions that were classified an Egyptian calendar dial in fragment C. He inferred also that there must have been a zodiac dial, and he read some more faint inscriptions on the surface of the fragment, which he transcribed, you can see on the right, and this he identified as a parapegma, named for a star calendar in the ancient world. So Rehm had clearly determined that the device was astronomical in nature. This is a page of Rehm's unpublished research notebooks. He did publish a couple of papers, but the most interesting work that he did remained in his unpublished research notebooks. They're a goldmine of interesting ideas and thoughts. And I've highlighted a marginal note there, and you can see the numbers 76 there. Tonischen. This is another page of his notebooks, and you can see the number 223. The fact that these numbers are in his notebooks means that Rehm must have seen this fragment here, which we call fragment 19, less than 5 centimeters long, very tiny fragment. And we sometimes call it the user manual for the mechanism, because it describes the underlying principles on which the mechanism worked. I'm going to show you that with a beautiful technique which was invented by Tom Malzbender, who I'm currently staying with, who was then at Hewlett-Packard, which looks at the surfaces of objects and enhances the... it's absolutely a key technique that we used for looking at the inscriptions. What Rehm must have seen was firstly 19 years for the Metonic cycle, Metonischen. And this is a cycle of the moon, which in fact originated in 5th century BC Babylon. They're named after a Greek astronomer, Meton of Athens. He also saw 76 years for the Calippic cycle. This is an improvement by the Greek astronomer Callippos of the Metonic cycle. He took 4 Metonic cycles and took out a single day. And he also read Sigma Kappa Gamma 223 in the ancient Greek letters for numbers system, which is for the lunar months of particularly the Metonic and Saros cycles in detail later. These are the key cycles you need to know to understand how the mechanism worked. In order to understand what these cycles mean, I'd just like to talk a little bit about ancient astronomy. When the ancient stars, which they referred to as the fixed stars, heave over from east to west as the Earth spins in the opposite direction. But they notice the movements of some astronomical bodies relative to the stars. And these were the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets known in the ancient world. And they all ecliptic. And the reason they do that in modern astronomical terms is that the solar system, these are all the bodies that are close to us, lies pretty much in a flat disk. And these movements were in the opposite direction to the movements of the star. Frame of reference for defining the positions of the astronomical bodies. For For example, the moon there we might think was about 6 degrees in Libra. On a particular night, near a prominent star at a particular phase, and it's moving relative to the stars in the direction of the arrow. And exactly 19 years later, I'm going to take another snapshot, and you'll see that it looks identical. And the reason for this is the Metonic cycle. In that lunar months, that's the phase cycle of the moon, from new moon through full moon back to new moon. So the moon is at the same phase after 19 years. And it's been through 254 sidereal months. This is the basic orbital cycle of the moon around the Earth, the cycle of the moon against the stars. So it's in the same position relative to the prominent star. So Rem was the first person to really understand the essence of the Antikythera mechanism as an astronomical calculating machine. He realized that it used bronze gear wheels to calculate these astronomical cycles. He got the mechanics completely wrong. He simply didn't have enough data. But he had these extraordinarily prescient ideas. You'll see at the top there's 4 coaxial pointers. And this is the form we think now that the front of the mechanism took. Here's another page of Rem's notebooks. And I just want to translate a couple of phrases here. The first says epicycle. And the second says eccentric. In turning, it turns an epicycle. Well, what are epicyclic gears? If you imagine a conventional mechanical clock, it has gears that turn on axles that sit in bearings in fixed plates. The bearings don't move, the axles don't move, the gears turn around. With epicyclic gearing, the bearing gear, the axle turns round while the gear is turning. It's really frankly, utterly shocking to propose for ancient Greece. You'd expect to have to wait till the Middle Ages to find this sort of gearing. It's a very subtle form of gearing. Rem had these, as I said, got everything mechanically wrong, but he had this that we realize that he was correct about this. He left this great legacy, but very unresolved legacy. And nearly half a century later, the next researcher was the great Derek de Solard-Price, who started studying the fragments in the early 1950s, American. He said the mechanism is like a great astronomical clock without an escapement. At least 20 gears have been preserved, including a very sophisticated assembly of gears that probably functioned as a sort of epicyclic or differential gear system. He probably got epicyclic gears from Rem. His differential gear system became his most famous proposal. Price was very persistent, and more than a decade later, he teamed up with a very distinguished Greek radiologist, Charalambos Karakalos, to carry out the first set of 27 gears in the main fragment. It was a truly complex mechanism. Now, if you want to know what a mechanism does, a geared mechanism that reproduces astronomical cycles, you want to count the teeth of the gears. And in the right-hand picture, you can see that the teeth of the gears have been marked for counting. Nearly all the gears are partial, so you get these sectors of gears, and you have to make estimates of the total number of teeth on the original gear from this partial information. And then they take the results to Price. Let me give you one example here. The Karakalos family said that this gear, that's the gear that nearly fills that square. You can see the teeth in the top left corner there. They estimated that this gear had 128 teeth. Price said he thought that this gear had 127 teeth. Apparently they were very irritated. They thought they'd done the scientific thing and that Price was massaging their figures. Let me just look at that gear here with one of our modern X-rays. and you can see the huge advantage of modern X-ray technology. You can see the traces of nearly all the teeth there. You can make a very reliable tooth count estimate, and Price was correct about the tooth count. It had 127 teeth. Well, what's a tooth between friends, you might ask? But it turns half of 254. It's the large prime factor of 254, the number of sidereal months in the 19-year Metonic cycle. So what Rem had found in the inscriptions, the Metonic cycle, Price found embodied in the gearing. It was a very important discovery. And Price went much further than this. He described how he thought this gear was embodied into the gear wheels of the device. On the right there, you can see the main surviving fragment with its characteristic large wheel, four-spoked wheel, sometimes called the main drive wheel. It goes round one turn a year. On the left, there's a computer reconstruction, and you can see a little crown input gear, which is where the device was turned from, probably via a knob or a crank or something like that. And if you look on the back of that gear there, there's another smaller gear, B2, 64 teeth, also goes around once a year. Price then said there's another gear that meshes with it, C1 with 38 teeth. I should say this is not an epicyclic gear. I've suppressed the main plate here so you can see the gears, but this sits in a on a fixed axis in a bearing in the main plate. And we can easily calculate how fast this gear turns by the simple laws of mesh 32 over 19, and 19 is clearly for the Metonic cycle. Price then said there's a couple more gears, 48 teeth, 24 teeth, simply doubles the ratio. The minus sign incident is because each time you mesh two gears, they turn in opposite directions. So this is the basic way the mechanism works. It builds up increasingly compound gear trains to calculate increasingly sophisticated ratios. Then comes Price's 127-tooth gear, meshes with another little gear, E2, with 32 teeth, and calculates, you do the simple arithmetic, calculates 254 over 19, which is the sidereal version of the Metonic cycle. It essentially calculates the average position of the moon in the zodiac. Now let me just look at the output gear for this. It's got a rather strange little pentagonal hub with a hole through it. Price thought that this gear then had proposed to show the average position of the moon in the zodiac. But in fact, the gear train takes a completely extraordinary journey, which I'm going to describe. This wasn't a fantasy on Price's part. Here we have in modern X-rays all the gears involved with this. Unusually, they all check out. This is a completely established part of the anti-back of the mechanism. And you'll notice there are two large gears, E3, E4, and on them sit two epicyclic gears, K1, K2. Well, why do we use epicyclic gears in gearing? One purpose for them, Price's gear train, then we can simply multiply and divide the tooth counts. We can't add or subtract ratios. We simply multiply and divide them. If you want to add or subtract ratios, you've got to use epicyclic gears. It's not obvious. It's difficult concept. What Price said was that this was all part of a differential system, differential difference. It calculated a difference. He said it calculated the difference between the basic orbital cycle of the moon around the Earth, the sidereal cycle, and from that it subtracted the orbit of the sun around the Earth. Remember, we're in geocentric, Earth-centered astronomy here. Brilliant idea on Price's part. Unfortunately, it was wrong. And this, I think, set back Price's. He didn't question it or challenge it. He just got famous from it. And one thing Price noticed in the system is a large gear there, E4. We call it somewhat confusingly lowercase e3 for very good reasons I won't go into. The Krakos family estimated 222 teeth for this gear, and Price wrote that you might think that this had something to do with the 223 lunar months of the Saros cycle, but in this context it can have no such meaning, and the reason for that was that this large gear pair, E3, E4, went round much too fast for it to have that sort of astronomical meaning, so he discarded the idea. He put together all his ideas about the gearing into a complicated gearing diagram. These are two versions of it, two schematic versions of it. You can see in the middle there the little metonic gear train we followed in blue there. And it is complicated, it's difficult to understand, won't describe it in detail. What I want to say about this model is that everything else is wrong, completely wrong. His sun wheel is wrong, his differential gear was wrong, his 4-year dial was wrong. And this is really where I came in terms of research. I wrote a paper called Challenging the Classic Research, which criticized this model on the basis that it was far too complicated for its simple outputs. It violated an essential principle in science, engineering, computer science, and technology, which is that you should keep things simple. It's sometimes called the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid, is the idea. It's a fundamental principle that everybody in science goes by. But Price, he didn't get everything wrong. He understood how the fragments, relative positions of the fragments, he got a huge amount right, in fact, which Rem had not been able to do. And he put this together into a basic architecture of the mechanism as a simple box with, at the front on the left there, you can see the dials, calendar dial and the zodiac dial that Rem proposed. And at the back, he said there's a, I believe he got completely right, but he got the function of these back dials wrong. After 20 years research, he put everything together in. By this time, Price was Avalon Professor of the History of Science at Yale University. And this paper defined the Antikythera mechanism for the next generation. It became the Bible for later researchers. Now, don't misunderstand me. I really revere Price. I think he's still the greatest researcher in Antikythera research history. You don't just make progress in science by getting everything right. You make progress also by getting things wrong in an interesting way. And he set the agenda for the whole future of research. When he died at an early age, the mantle was taken over by two more researchers. On the left there, Professor Alan Bromley from Sydney University, a professor of computer science. Seen there, I should say, not with the Antikythera mechanism, but with part of one of Charles Babbage's computing engines. He was a considerable expert on Charles Babbage. And on the right there is Michael Wright, who was then curator of mechanical engineering at the Science Museum in London. They had become skeptical about Price's model, I have to say, some years before I had, but unknown to myself. The problem with the Krakos X-rays was all the gears were overlapping. They were two-dimensional X-rays. You couldn't easily distinguish the 3D depth of the gears or the mechanical structure. And they used this early technique of 3D X-rays called linear tomography. I won't go into the technique. It's very hard to interpret the results. Now, I should say, sadly, that Alan Bromley died before the full fruits of this research could take place. But Michael Wright was extremely, which I've listed there. I don't possibly have space here to go into all of Michael Wright's research, but he produced some very important results. And I'm going to talk about some of these as I go through. To start with, I'm going to talk about this metonic calendar. That's the upper back dial of the mechanism. That's the dial which Price said was a 4-year dial, which was frankly a very boring and simplistic idea. But in Gears from the Greeks, Price also wrote that there's a possibility that there might be 47 months for each turn of this dial, 5 turns of the dial, 5 47s is 235, and it might be a Metonic calendar dial. But he threw away his brilliant idea, and it was taken up with great perception by Michael Wright, who went much further. He proposed gearing for turning the pointer of this calendar dial. And I'm going to strip off the case and show you the gearing. It starts just the same way as Price's Metonic gear train with a little gear width. Then there is a gear with 53 teeth. Now bear with me going through this rather detailed look. It is really, I assure you, worth it. Now, I was a mathematician, and 53 teeth, it's a bizarre prime number. It's not a prime number that you'd expect to turn up. Developing model at the time, I changed it to 54, which turned out to be a huge mistake. If we look at this gears with our X-rays, we have enough teeth to make a tooth count estimate, and 53 is the correct answer for it. Its meaning is extraordinary. I'm going to put the rest of the gear there with 53 teeth, which it's a conjectural gear. We don't have any physical evidence for it, but it must have been there because we only want the ratio 5/19. It's a 5-turn dial over 19 years. So the 53 teeth gears cancel each other out. So what on earth are they doing there? Why is this gear train so complicated? It dramatically seems to contradict the KISS principle that you should keep things at the heart of the Antikythera mechanism. By 2005, Michael Wright had produced a model which had the planets at the front on a very bold scheme he had with 8, and I believe he's fundamentally correct about that. I have arguments with him about Price's idea of a Metonic calendar with great perception and proposed the gearing. But for the bottom dial, he had a draconitic month dial. Now, the draconitic month is a month which is to do with the possibility of an eclipse happening. And Michael Wright had modified Price's differential to produce this draconitic month. Price's model produced the lunar month. Michael Wright modified the tooth counts on the gears to produce the draconitic month. And he said that it was displayed, 4 draconitic months were displayed over the 4 turns of the dial on a scale with 218 half days. As soon as I read this, I was sure that it had to be wrong. In parallel with Michael Wright's work, there was a new initiative set up by a distinguished astronomer at Cardiff University in Wales called Professor Mike Edmonds, in the top left corner picture there. And he gathered a group of people around him, including Greek astronomers and including myself. This time I'd become completely fascinated with the Antikythera mechanism. I'd become absolutely passionate about it. I was extremely frustrated that we had no good data. We didn't have a good set of still photographs. We couldn't find the Caracalos X-rays anywhere, and Michael Wright didn't want to share his data with us. So I started to look around for new ways of gathering data on the Antikythera mechanism. And in a science mentored by Tom Maltzbender, who's sitting somewhere over there, can't see him, but who was then at Hewlett-Packard Laboratories. And this is the technique that you saw with fragment 19 for looking at surfaces. This is what we wanted to see, the inscriptions on the surfaces of the fragments. But we wanted to look inside them with the gears, with 3D X-rays. And I found this, another world-leading company called X-Tek Systems, just northwest of London, set up by Roger Hadland, who's the man in the middle of the bottom right group there. And so we had all our techniques that we wanted to use on the mechanism, and the sticking point was getting permission from the Greek authorities. Now, this took nearly 5 years. At one stage, we were turned down early on in the process. We then got a grant from the Leverhulme Trust to fund everything. And just about a month later, we were turned down again. So we had our technology team, huge persistence of Professor Xenophon Moussas, who's in the bottom left of the top left group, that we actually finally got permission to do the thing. The whole thing was, frankly, a nightmare and very tough on myself because we just spent years failing to get our permissions. But in the fall of 2005, we ended up at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and there we were looked after by 2 senior staff, archaeologist Mary Zaferopoulou on the left there, and head of chemistry, Dr. Eleni Mangou. When we started our studies, we knew of these fragments here, plus a few more bits and pieces that Price mentioned in Gears from the Greeks. And then one day, Mary came to our team and said she'd found some more boxes of bits in the basement store of the museum. Might we be interested? Which you can see here. And we subjected all the fragments to our 2 investigative techniques. Bottom left, bottom right, you can see Tom Maltzbender with his mysterious dome covered in flashlights that he uses for his reflectance transformation imaging, or polynomial texture mapping as we knew it in those days. Top left, you can see X-Tech Systems manhandling an 8-ton X-ray machine into the basement of the Muse project. If you want to do 3D X-rays, you need to be able to penetrate your samples through all the angles, including the long angles. So they made an X-ray machine with double the X-ray power of anything else comparable in the world at the time. So around there you see a lot more images of data gathering. And of course the most important activity there in the center, which was having fine meals in the restaurants in Athens. After a week with Hewlett-Packard, 2.5 weeks with X-Tech Systems, both brought superb teams. I have to say they were wonderful teams to Athens. We ended up with a superb set of data, around 1 terabyte of data. What you see there is a mixture of still photographs, the Hewlett-Packard surface imaging technique, and slice false color. The most important thing to realize about this data is that everything you see there is at millimeter scales, size of the teeth of the 6 millimeters, and this exquisite detail preserved despite 2,000 years underwater. We'd surface plates, and that X-Tech's 3D X-rays would show us the gears inside the fragments, and that all turned out to be true. But text inside the fragments, completely invisible from the surface, hidden for 2,000 years, unread for 2,000 years. Price found around a wonderful revelation. When we got this data, we all took it back to our facilities to examine it, and I was charged with trying to sort out the mechanical structure of the device. And I started not with the main fragment, fragment A, because we had some severe technical difficulties with the data for that. So I started with this little fragment F, one of the fragments Mary had found in the basement store, around 9 centimeters long. And it looks like nothing special at all, like something you might pick up on a beach. Bit of green suggesting some bronze, maybe. Front of it there. And there's really nothing of any interest there. And I'm going to go down through the fragment in parallel slices, close apart, to see what we can find. If I go down through the fragment, I start to see what looks like part of a dial. And I go down further, it becomes sharper. And then I see. And I developed a very simple strategy, which is if you want to know what a dial does, and you've only got part of it, and you've got scale divisions, in order to understand its function, you want a strategy. But I have to say it was not followed with any great consistency by previous researchers. That Price had seen visible on the surface at the back of the main fragment, fragment A, looked very similar. And I could determine the relative orientations of the fragments and put them together, together with another little fragment E with similar divisions in it. And suddenly I had quite a lot of data around this dial on which to extrapolate the total number of divisions around the dial. And this came, you may have guessed the answer already, the number of divisions round the dial came to the remarkable number 223. This was our first major breakthrough from our new data. I just want to explain a little bit about the Saros cycle and how it works. If you have an eclipse of the sun or the moon in a particular month, and you look 223 lunar months later, just over 18 years later, you get another very similar eclipse of the sun or the moon. And this repeat eclipse goes on repeating. It works because 223 lunar months is the same as a whole number of draconitic months. This is a month that tells us whether an eclipse is possible. And the fact that it's the same as a whole number of anomalistic months, the anomalistic month is the variable motion cycle of the moon. The moon sometimes looks as if it's going slower against the stars and sometimes faster. In modern terms, we know that's because it has an elliptical orbit. Sometimes it's further away. And this ensures that the repeat eclipse is very similar. It's a remarkable chance resonance between three of them. Now, there was more in this little fragment F than that. In some X-ray slices, you can see these little groups of text letters and symbols, which I call glyphs. And if you look round the dial, there's some inscriptions. And again, this reminded me of Tom Malzbender's technique. So now I could trace all these glyphs in our three fragments, A, E, and F, and put them all round the dial in their correct positions. And you'll notice that some of them a lot of them are 6 months apart, some of them just 5 months apart, and some of them are in adjacent months. This is exactly the pattern of eclipses of the sun and moon in the astronomical record. So the glyphs must be the eclipse predictions. More information in these glyphs than just the presence of a lunar or solar eclipse. So let me decode some of them. I soon realized stood for Selene, the ancient Greek goddess of the moon, clearly indicating a lunar eclipse. At the top of some, Eta, Helios, god of the sun, for a solar eclipse. Some of the glyphs, like the one in the middle there, had both a sigma and an eta for a month which had both a lunar and a solar eclipse. All the glyphs had this unusual anchor-type symbol, which took me a long time to decode until I finally found it in a book of ancient Greek horoscopes, standing for Aura, Greek for hour. And it's always followed by either a letter or, in this case, a special symbol digamma for the number 6, hour of the eclipse. The mechanism didn't just predict the presence of an eclipse in a particular month, but the hour of the day of the eclipse, many years or decades hence. There was another letter, which I'd seen, but I hadn't understood. And after our first paper was published in Nature, a very distinguished historian of ancient astronomy, Professor Alexander Jones, came to our conference that we organized, and he told me something that I'd missed about these letters. I feel somewhat shamefaced to admit that I missed this, but they are in alphabetical order. And there's a whole alphabet's worth of index letters without bars on, followed by a second alphabet with bars on top. And these must surely in some way refer to the inscriptions round the dial. So by this time I had a nice story that I had the dial as an eclipse prediction dial, I had the glyphs, and this index letter system. I can't go into the whole system, don't have space. If you're interested, you can Google Antikythera +1, that's Public Library of Science 1, and it's an open access journal, anyone can read it. I'd just say that this is a prediction scheme of quite astonishing ambition. The index letters, you look at the index letter in the glyph, you look at it in the inscriptions, and that tells you characteristics of the eclipse. It's an extraordinary scheme. How was the pointer turned? Like Michael Wright had determined how the pointer was turned for the upper dial. That's all the gearing we saw for Michael Wright's gearing for the Metonic calendar dial. And I want to turn the lower back dial. And again, I've suppressed the main plate so you can see the gears, but there's really only one axis which can turn this, and that's this little axis M. The gearing branches here to the upper back dials and to the lower back dials. And I need a gear with 223 teeth. It's a prime number, can't break it down into smaller gearing. And if you look at the back of the main fragment, fragment A, there's really only one good candidate gear, E3 there. It's not the ring gear inside it, it's the bigger gear, slightly harder to see outside that. This is the gear that Price called E4, and the Caraculus family counted as 222 teeth. Price rejected the idea that it was the 223 months of the Saros cycle. But if we look in our X-rays, we can see many teeth, we can make a reliable tooth count, and 223 is the right answer. Price had again a brilliant idea, which he'd thrown away. And he threw it away because of his differential. Now, let me put that into our gear diagram. There's the gear pair there. We need to turn it from this little axis M here. And now we can start to calculate how fast these gears turn. We know already how fast axis M turns. It's this bizarre fraction with the number 53 in, which you'll remember, which cancelled itself up in Wright's gear train. We calculate how fast E3, E4 turn, and we get this rather strange fraction, 9 times 53 over 223 times 19. But it will turn out to be a very significant ratio, as we'll see. The next gear in the train is another gear with 53 teeth. And by this time, I was getting extremely disturbed by all of this, because again, the 53 is cancelled out. It's not used in this gear train. If we look at what we need, sorry, just to say, this is the gear, reliable count says 53 teeth. So it was correct. If we look at the gear train, we don't want 53 in the final answer. We just want, it's a 4 test, the ratio we want to turn our Saros pointer. We don't need this extraordinary, bizarre, strange and disturbing prime number 53. This gear E3, this large gear, had found no role in any previous model. Now it has two roles. It turns, no, sorry, it has one role. It has an essential role in turning the Saros pointer. So everything now seemed to be going on the right lines. In our modern X-rays, we can see all these gears except for the conjectural one. All the tooth counts check out. It's a completely established part of how the Antikythera mechanism works. And so this was a nice story. I had the dial, I had the gearing, but I also had a huge problem, which is if you look at the back of fragment A, inside the large gear E3, there's another couple of gears. Differential system, which I was sure by that time was wrong. And I'm going to look at them more closely, and I'm going to examine them with our X-rays. Now, if you look there, the gears on the left look like they're the gears on the right, but they're not actually those gears. I have to come forward a millimeter towards us, and you see then two more gears, and these are the gears on the right. There's 4 gears in this system. To Price's great credit, he saw that. And I want to look at the bottom gears, which are epicyclic gears, K1 and K2, and a particular feature of K2, which is very evident there, which is that it's got this notch out of it. Now, this was noticed in 1902, very early on, by Rados, but he didn't understand it. It was noticed by Price, who thought it was evidence that a tooth had broken, had been repaired, and the repair had dropped out. But Michael Wright, with his new X-rays, made a far more acute observation. He said that there's a pin on K1 which engages with a slot on K2, and in that way, gear K1 carries gear K2 around. Now, idea, the gears will turn with the same speed, and you might simply just as well attach them to the same axle. But Wright made another really astonishing observation. He said that the gears turn on slightly different axes, slightly eccentric axes. The difference in the centers is just about a millimeter. And this makes all the difference. I want you to forget for a moment that these are epicyclic gears, and I'm going to show you a little animation that shows what this system does. I'm going to imagine that K1 goes round at a constant rate of the mean sidereal month. That's the gear with the pin on there. You can see K1. And on top of it sits K2. And as the gears turn, you'll see sometimes K2 is behind, and sometimes it's ahead of the pin of the slot gear. Notice that in this fixed axis situation, the period of rotation of the slot gear is the same as the input period, the sidereal month, and I'll come back to that. Wright considered this in a rather throwaway paragraph in one of his papers, and he discarded the idea because in his model of 2005, this large gear E3 rotated much too fast, 60 times too fast, for this to work in any meaningful way. He rejected this idea for exactly the same reason that Price rejected the idea that E3 might have 223 teeth. The gear E3 turned much too fast. But in my developing model, E3 turns, you remember, the Saros dial, which is a dial. So it's going around very slowly. So maybe this is a promising idea. The second key question is, why is the pin and slot mounted epicyclically on E3? And I'm going to explain why that is. And I'm going to revert now to modern astronomy to talk about the reason. This is the lunar orbit, and it's an ellipse, as we know in modern astronomy. I've exaggerated the ellipse there very much. It's much more like a circle, but it is elliptical. Apogee is the point when the moon appears to be going slowest against the stars, because it's furthest away, and perigee when it's going fastest. And I want you to imagine the moon starting at a prominent star, which you can see on the right, going all the way round the zodiac and back to the same prominent star. This is the sidereal month, which we talked about, period of about 27.32 days on average. Now, you might think that the moon then had got back to its slowest motion at apogee. But in fact, that's not the case, because the apogee has moved round a little bit in the meanwhile. The so-called line of apsides that joins perigee and apsides processes round in a very slow period of just under 9 years. So the anomalistic month, stay with me if you can, the anomalistic month, which is this, the month of the variable motion cycle of the moon, is just a bit longer than the sidereal month, only about 5.5 hours longer. Remarkably, the ancient Babylonian astronomers knew of this difference between the sidereal and anomalistic month, as did the ancient Greeks, but none of them knew about elliptical orbits. But the ancient Greeks were brilliant geometers, and they had a very beautiful theory for explaining this anomalous orbit of the moon. They said you can explain it as the sum of two simple circular motions. There's a large circular motion with the period anomalistic month. The pink dot is the actual moon, and it traces out an orbit which is like a squashed off-center circle. Each time it's slightly different as it goes round, and each time it takes a bit longer than at the sidereal month to get to the red line, to get to apogee. Sometimes the moon is behind the average moon, and sometimes it's ahead of the moon. And it models the elliptical theory, the modern theory of the moon, in a very beautiful way. Yes, the red line there is equivalent to the line of apsides of the orbit. That's the one end is where it's furthest from the Earth, and the other end where it's closest, where it appears to be moving furthest. So this is the ancient Greek epicyclic theory of the moon. Very beautiful theory. And I'm going to return to my mechanism now to ask some questions. And the key question is, how fast must this large gear E3 rotate so that this little pin and slot device exactly models this ancient Greek epicyclic theory? You remember that its basic input needs to be the sidereal month, but the period of the variability needs to be this other slightly longer month, the anomalistic month. And I have to say this isn't easy. If you're encountering this for the first time, it may be you're not following it in total detail. I want to give you a flavor of what the thinking was. So the cyclic theory of the moon, and the answer turns out to be that it must rotate at the rotation which is the difference between the sidereal month and the anomalous slow rotation with a period of just under 9 years. Now we can calculate this from the Metonic and Saros cycles. I'll let you do that as a little exercise to do at home. Simple arithmetic. We come out with this fraction 9 times 53 over 223 times 19, which you'll remember we already have as the rotation of E3 when we were calculating the gearing for the lower back dial, the Saros dial. It's turning E3 at exactly the right rate so that the pin and slot models this ancient Greek theory of the moon. It is, I have to say, extraordinary. 2 rolls. It turns the Saros pointer, and it carries epicyclically this little pin and slot device together. That's E3 rotating at this rate, with a period of just under 9 years. That's, you remember Price's little Metonic gear train on the little, which output on a little regular pentagon. It's the slot gear with 50 teeth, and this generates this another gear with 50 teeth. So to summarize this system, we have the pin and slot mounted epicyclically to change the period in which a shocking system. It's, in my view, an incredible idea. It's a work of absolute genius. And realizing that this is how it worked, a whole cascade of consequences came out then, that all the tooth counts could be explained from the Metonic and Saros cycle. And it's often in science you make a breakthrough and everything else follows from it. It was a fantastic feeling of discovery. And I'd assumed, like everybody else, that the gearing at the back of the mechanism, if the output went the other way, through the little hole, you remember, in the pentagonal hub, we can see all this stuff in our X-rays. Position of the moon in the zodiac, that's where you want this sidereal month. Was a completely crazy thing to attempt in ancient Greece. But the craziness end of this output, and I'm going to show you that from another angle, and it shows the phase of the moon. Take the cover of this off to show you how it works. It's just got two little gears in it. It's got an epicyclic crown gear with 20 teeth, which meshes between the sidereal rotation of the moon round the Earth and the rotation of the sun round the Earth. The annual cycle of the sun round the Earth looks like. This is the back of fragment A. These are the gears at the dials. These are the fragments that show the back plate of the mechanism with the twin dial system, top and bottom. We come round now to the front of fragment A, which we believe are part of a conjectural planetary system, first proposed by Michael Wright. This is my radically simplified gearing for it, showing the date, the sun, the moon, and all 5 planets known in the ancient world. This is fragment C, and it comes from all over the front of the mechanism. Quite a jig. Then there's the zodiac and calendar scales, and all these, plus these little fragments here, show Rem's parapegma at the top, star calendar at the top and bottom of the device. Everything in a wooden box turned by a little... well, the archaeology is the first port of call for this. There have been 2 major studies on this, both high-quality studies, particularly the superb study by the director, Dr. Nicholas Kaltsas. Both studies, and it was scattered all over the ancient Greek world, mostly in the eastern part, but still some amphora from Italy, coin from Syracuse, east to west. Probably going to Rome, but not definitely. The route of the ship, whatever you read on the internet, is not really known. There's a lot of misinformation on the internet about the Antikythera mechanism, I have to say. You have to be right. Almost nothing about the origin of the mechanism. So we want more sorts of information. And there are some very remarkable classical texts by Cicero, who wrote first about a device made by Posidonius, which at each revolution reproduces the same motions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets that take place in the heavens every day and night. Cicero knew Posidonius. He was a pupil of Posidonius, as in his Stoic school with Rhodes. But Cicero also wrote about Archimedes. They were described as globes, sphaerae, which are Thwanders, the 5 planets. Archimedes had thought out a way to represent accurately by a single device for turning the globe those various and divergent movements with their different rates of speed, just like the Antikythera mechanism. But Archimedes was based in Syracuse. Possible origins, widely spaced across the ancient Greek Empire. But we'd like much better information than this, and some of comes from the from essentially cultural information in this little fragment B, which is our evidence for the upper back dial, the Metonic calendar dial. Let me show you that fragment and see some inscriptions between the month divisions. And I'll just go down through some X-rays. Typically, you have to go down through the text. And I didn't have any idea what this meant. I don't read Greek, I don't know ancient Greek, so I talked to my Greek colleagues and they couldn't work out what this meant. And then we agreed to send it to Alexander Jones, and kind of difficult to figure out what that month name is. But because the calendar has 235 months, the month names will be repeated month cell. Put the information together, and I get the month Dodecates. Now, after several weeks, or even I think it was months of work, Alex Jones and I managed to decipher all 12 month names, or at least I deciphered one. Just had enough information from the X-rays and some characters from Tom Maltzbender's PTMs to get just enough information to get all the month names. And there was to individual city-states, but the month names themselves worked out by Alex Jones based on work by Katerina Trumpy. Look very closely, map prepared by Lena Anastasi of the Aristotle University with the Antikythera calendar. And you can see these blue squares right across the ancient Greek world. They don't tell us about geography. If we look at the green month names, in the little green squares, you have to look quite carefully. Were exceptional months, they were rare months, and they came uniquely from the calendar of Corinth. And so this established that the calendar was a Corinthian calendar. It's a very exciting new result to Sicily and Archimedes. Western University suggests that this is wrong. They believe that this is the calendar, a calendar most likely from the northwestern area of Greece called Epirus. Let me put that on the map there. And there was more information in this little fragment B. If you look there, there's a little subsidiary dial inside the Metonic calendar dial. Let me show you that in close-up. And one day I read the word, looked it up on the internet, and found that particularly relevant to the Antikythera mechanism. So again, I sent it to Alex Jones, again by return email. It always seemed to be by return email with Alex. For the games at Corinth, the Pythian games for the games at Delphi, at Olympia. Now these are the major crown games. Extraordinary, really. But we had these crown games. This was an Olympiad dial. Any dial on any mechanism that had an Olympiad dial would have these crown games. They were the major games. But in ancient Greece, there were hundreds of little minor games. And there was one up here called the Na, and another one here, which was pretty much under the text might mean. So let me deal with the Na first. Does anyone happen to know where the Naian games, the Na, were held? No? Well, let me tell you, they were held at Dodona in the Epir. So we were building up a very nice confidence, but there was a sting in the tail of this research. If I can go, and he suggested the Aliaea, and I'm almost certain that he's correct. Well, again, let me go back to my geography. Does anyone know where the Aliaea were? So our comfortable story fell apart, and we really don't know how to resolve this. I think you have to make up your own narrative. In the games in Rhodes, we really don't know, but this is the best, still unresolved, but very interesting, I think. So let me look at when's identity. Again, the archaeology is the starting point. Both studies agree objects from the wreck 4th century BC to the middle of the 1st century BC, 5 BC. And this gives us a terminus antiquem information to a timeline this time. These two studies say terminus antiquem mid-1st century BC. But obviously we want closer information than this. And there's information in and epigraphers, of which I'm very much not one, do stylistic analysis of the letter forms and can give information from that about the date of the inscription. They notice things like the omicrons are all small. The pies tend to have their second leg shorter than the... Now, I have to say this process is a bit more, let me put some information about different epigraphers' views on our timeline. Wilhelm, in the early days, probably wisely gave a rather wide range, century BC, which agreed with Price. He says the subtitle of Gears from the Greeks is a calendar computer from about 80 BC, and he had an argument for saying it was made in 80 BC, which I think all of us now believe is spurious. Chrytsas worked with our group like a firmer date, and some information comes out of the astronomy. Remember Rem's cycles that he identified in this fragment? Well, the latest of these is the Callippic cycle, launched as a terminus postquem for the mechanism in 330 BC. Let me add that to my timeline. There it is. Not a huge advance here. But there's more in the astronomy than that. You remember that it took 4 generations of researchers to work out this, that the mechanism exactly models the ancient Greek epicyclic theory of the moon. And the 2nd century AD, Ptolemy attributed this invention of this theory to Hipparchus of Nicaea, with those dates there. But Apollonius of Perga, it's known, developed epicyclic theories of the planets, and he was said to have been called Epsilon because the shape of an epsilon is like a crescent moon because of his work on the moon. So it seems very plausible, even likely, that Apollonius might have developed an epicyclic theory of the moon. So let me add that to our information. Depends who you believe invented this epicyclic lunar theory. So that's where it remained until a year or two ago. Some quite astonishing work by an Argentinian researcher, Christian Carmen, and James Evans from Puget Sound University. And they presented this work at a conference in Leiden in the Netherlands. And the arguments were so difficult, I have to say, based on complicated aspects of Babylonian eclipse prediction practice, many assumptions, and I think most of us got lost. I certainly did around a third of the way through or before then. So when they announced their result, which was astonishing, I think they must have been disappointed with our reaction. They said that they'd sequentially eliminated possibilities to determine that the full moon of month 1 of the dial is May the 12th, 205 BC. Not only 100-year range for them, a particular day on which the Saros dial started. Now, I got lost, even though I'd been studying this dial pretty intensively, and I'd been looking at the times in the glyphs, the eclipse times. And I believed that these times were not based on observations by the Greeks or even a set of earlier observations by, say, the Babylonians. I believe they were generated by a simple mathematical model using the methods of the time. And it's quite a good model. It's not, unfortunately, an exact model. I'm still working on this. But when I synchronized this mathematical model of the eclipse times with C, I was completely astonished by this. Our assumptions were contradictory, and the date was exactly the same. Now, I'd like to say with confidence that I can tell you this is times model, which I've slightly improved, but I'm looking for an exact model. If they were using interesting data, it's much earlier than any previous date. The earliest previous date, famous scientists and astronomers listed with their dates there. History, this is all happening in the Hellenistic era. Archimedes was dead by just 7 years with this date. My own belief is that Archimedes probably, it started the tradition of making these devices. We can't be certain of that, but the Cicero description is very remarkable. Eratosthenes, I really don't know, distinguished Greek astronomer, but no obvious connection with the mechanism. Apollonius, well, his epicyclic theories of the planets were almost certainly incorporated into the mechanism. The gearing's gone, so we can't be certain. And the theory of the moon, which may well be attributed to him, is also included. Maybe Apollonius worked with Archimedes. They knew historical record is so fragmentary, which you as classicists will be all too aware of. I'm going to finish on an animation of the mechanism, which is an exploded diagram which comes together to form the mechanism. Nearly all of this gearing, particularly the gearing at the back, is now established. The planetary gearing at the front is conjectural, but something calculating the planets was almost certainly there. And I'd like to quote Derek de Solla Price, who wrote, "It's frightening to know that the ancient Greeks, just before the fall of their great civilization, came so close to our own age, not only in their thought, but in their scientific technology." I would say that it's shocking. And I'm not going to answer the question why. I'm going to incorporate that into questions that you might have. I've just put a list of possibilities there, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Tony. We can have one or two questions. Any responses? Can you take it? Yes.
Is there some new technological discovery that could help get more information about this mechanism? Is there new techniques beyond X-ray tomography that would help?
I think that we could do another X-ray analysis. X-ray technology's moved on and is higher resolution, and we might therefore be able to resolve some of the uncertain letters in the inscriptions and things like this. But this is kind of a slightly marginal process, I think. And maybe the investment and the difficulties of doing it might not justify it. I'd love to do it myself, but I blanch at the thought of another 5 years to get permissions to do it. The other thing, obvious thing, is that we'd love to find another of these mechanisms. And there's, you know, the problem is that this thing sticks up like a sore thumb in terms of the history of technology. The next mechanism you find that exists is a device about 700 or 800 later, which is a Byzantine device called the London Sundial Calendar. Very simple device, had just about 8 gears. And it's as if technology went backwards for that period. And then you have to go to the 14th century to an astronomical clock made by Richard of, made by Richard of Wallingford at St. Albans. So it's, you know, it sticks up there. It doesn't have any predecessors. There must have been simpler devices before this. Nobody sort of sits down one day and builds something as sophisticated as this. It's impossible, isn't it? There must have been simple devices. Maybe something that would calculate the mean position of the moon in the zodiac, a few gears, like Price's Metonic gear train. But all these artifacts are missing. And I think the problem is that bronze artifacts that survived on the surface, as it were, that went in shipwrecks, nearly all got melted down in later history. One classicist told me that after the sack of Corinth, there were known to be, I think, 3,000 bronze statues there, and nothing at all survived, she said, not even a big toe. So the problem is that bronze things, you know, these mechanisms, they would have stopped working and they would have been melted down. It was such a valuable material. So we really have to look in shipwrecks. And the optimistic thing is now that there are really good technologies for looking for shipwrecks, particularly deep shipwrecks. Recently in the, I think it's called the Fornai Archipelago, they've found 22 wrecks, unexplored wrecks. They're probably just full of amphorae, but someday, maybe not in my lifetime, somebody may find another of these mechanisms and give us much more information. There's quite a lot of There's Cicero's, in BC times, there's Cicero's texts. There's a quote by Vitruvius, which describes similar type of thing, also 1st century BC. And in early centuries AD, there are other quotes that describe similar devices used by astronomers and astrologers and so on. So there's a sort of feeling that they were around. I'm sure it wasn't unique. I'm sure it was copied. I'm sure this wasn't the first version of it, because there are very, very few mistakes in any of the inscriptions or the way the gears are cut. There's very few corrections that we can see. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it is hugely frustrating. Oh, just one more thing is that Pappus of Alexandria in the 4th century AD said that Archimedes had written a treatise called On Spherae. And it's thought that that treatise refers to these mechanisms. There's some argument about whether it does, or whether the spherae might have been actually more spherical. But apart from that, we would absolutely love to find that treatise, you know. And I understood, for example, that there was a possibility that there's another library at Herculaneum, I don't know if anyone knows about this, buried deeper than the original library, where there's all these charred manuscripts, which are beginning to be read. So there's a chance we might find some texts, you know, remarkable things turn up, and I hope so. Yes, sir.
If this technology had not been lost, how far do you think we would be now?
Well, you know,
where would we be now?
Arthur C. Clarke wrote, he said that if the ancient Greeks had understood the power, the strength of their technology, then they would have been able to get to the moon within the next 300 years, and we'd now be exploring the nearest stars. It's a bit fanciful, honestly. It's a bit speculative. I don't know the answer. I'm not really a historian. I don't. It's really much over to you in terms of history. And I put here a whole, you know, even why it was made is not clear. I put a whole load of ideas there that people have suggested, that it was a demonstration device. I think it was much more than that. That it was some sort of rich person's toy, like a luxury astronomical watch people might wear, well, maybe. It's been suggested it was an astrologer's tool, but I don't think we believe that, because none of the inscriptions contains any scrap of astrology. It's all pure science that we can read. And I think if it was designed for astrology, there'd be a little bit and piece about ascendants and houses or whatever. My own view is that it's perfectly capable of making an adding machine or a multiplying machine. I think that took nearly, but it's, you know, it's very speculative. Was it a computer? Well, I made produced a film called The World's First Computer, or the BBC version's called, in more technical terms, it's not really a computer. It doesn't have programs and stored programs.
We can take one more question.
There's obviously appears to be a lot of precision metalworking in this. Is this typical of the metalworking of the time?
Well, there's two things I can think of which show that they were very skilled in metalwork. First is if you look at the jewelry, ancient Greek jewelry, it is exquisite and fine and very detailed. They had the ability to work at this small scale. And the small scale itself is remarkable. It must have been made to be portable. You know, you'd never, you know, the pin and slot, the eccentric axes, just about 1.1 millimeters apart, and had to be quite accurate. And to properly model the variable motion of the moon. So it was made to in all the text, this tiny text, you know, you imagine, I don't know, haven't calculated yet, but it probably had 15 to 20,000 text characters on it, on average 1.6 millimeters high. One thing that is very remarkable is this proposal by Michael Wright of this coaxial pointer system at the front. You can imagine having to make 8 coaxial tubes that fit closely inside each other. And he often quotes the ancient Greek aulos, which was a flute that had 2 concentric, very tightly fitting tubes to show that they had that capability. But it's still remarkable. I should say that at University College London, we're soon to begin 2 doctoral programs, one with an absolutely brilliant student we're going to explore the making of the mechanism and the techniques that we used, because it's not put together like a modern clock with all the gears separated with air spaces. Many of the gears appear to be touching each other. They move, they slide on these special sort of sliders. The main drive wheel has these brackets that hold them down, completely against modern practice. It's made in a different way. Most of the models that you might see on the web are made using modern principles. We're exploring all those, you know, it's the sort of original language of mechanical engineering and how they did that. So there's lots of questions that we want to try and answer in a very sort of experimental archaeology type of way, really.
There are clearly many, many more questions, and some of them, in fact, on the board this very minute, posed by Tony himself. But for now, please join me in thanking Tony for sharing such virtuosic study of such fascinating material. Thank you very much indeed.
Can I say one more thing, Grant?
Certainly.
If Archimedes had nothing to do with this, it's certainly cleverer than anything we know that Archimedes did make. So if Archimedes didn't have anything to do with it, who did? This is a real question, because it is a device of genius. It's just, you know, maybe there's somebody unknown, but, you know, it is cleverer than any of Archimedes' known devices. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Stanford Humanities Center. For more information, please visit us at shc.stanford.edu.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.